Okay, awesome. All right, so today we're going to focus a little bit on economics. I know economics is a very broad topic and it tends to come up a lot during debates, but today we're just going to focus on some of the basics and fundamentals. This might not necessarily directly apply to a specific round, but these are the types of things that I want you guys to be thinking about during a lot of rounds that touch on economic themes, just so you can sort of better engage with a lot of the different types of motions that end up showing up in a lot of these rounds that we have. So here's a general organization of today's seminar. Part one, we're going to cover some basic economic concepts, right? And then part two, we're going to be talking about economics arguments that tend to come up in debates, as well as trade-offs that are necessarily related to a lot of these economic debate rounds that we end up having. All right, part one, basic economic concepts. So what is economics, right? This is a word that everyone throws around a lot, right? So economics is basically a study of how individuals, businesses, and governments make choices when they have to deal with incentives and scarcity, right? That's a very broad term. So let's sort of unpack that a little bit. An incentive is merely something, it's a reward or a penalty that encourages a specific action, right? So on an individual level, if you want to, if you want to get a high mark on a test, right? Like that could be a potential incentive for you to actually put in the work and actually study for it, right? So the incentive to study for that specific test is that you want a necessarily high mark or a good sort of outcome as a result of it, right? On a large scale, right? When we choose to put money in things like savings accounts, one of the incentives that we have for doing that is that the bank gives us interest, and as a result, we end up, with marginally higher money than we initially started with, right? So that's an incentive that exists to pursue that kind of action, right? So incentives are all around us, right? We have incentives literally at individual levels, at a group level, at a societal level that like make us, more inclined towards certain actions over other actions, right? So like, I don't know, like one incentive to like invest in Dogecoin might be that you want it to go to the moon and you want to end up a billionaire like Elon Musk, right? So anyway, that's an incentive, right? That's what an incentive is. Okay, let's talk a little bit about scarcity then. What is scarcity? Notably, we do not have the ability to get every single thing that we want, right? Resources in our society are not infinite. We have a finite amount of things that we can have at any given point, and that reflects scarcity that ends up existing in a lot of different economic situations, right? So on an individual level, if you have a certain block of time on Friday night that is free, you can either spend that time going to a party or you can spend that time studying. But if both activities take up the same amount of time, then you cannot do both, right? You have to make an individual choice in this context. At a larger scale, if you have a certain amount of tax money that is allocated towards a certain purpose, right, you can either use that tax money to build affordable housing, or you can use it to support existing charities. But if both causes require the same amount of money, you cannot fund both in this specific context, right? We do not have infinite amounts of resources. This includes time, this includes money, this includes a lot of different things. We don't have an infinite amount of it. And as a result, we're going to have to ask questions regarding the scarcity aspect of those resources and the way in which we end up distributing them in society. Okay, there are two major sort of fields in economics. There's still there's like international economics and there's like developmental economics, which are sort of like more sort of subsections of it. But in general, we have microeconomics and we have macroeconomics, right? So microeconomics focuses around choices that are made by individuals and businesses, right? So either like private firms or like just like by people in general in the markets, right? And it's how those choices necessarily impact the market in a specific contained situation, or what the government reaction to those actions are, right? So notably, right, like you might ask some questions in microeconomics, such as why are people downloading more movies, right? That might be a question that might be asked, right? These are reflecting individual choices. Or you might ask a question which would be, how would a tax on e-commerce affect Amazon, for example, right? I think in this context, if we take the second question, if there was a tax on e-commerce, perhaps the demand for Amazon would go down because people might be disincentivized by the higher prices that would then end up existing that they would have to pay in the form of a tax, right? So these are questions that we ask about very individualized situations. Macroeconomics is looking at the summary of the entire national economy or looking at the global economy, right? So this is not just dealing with even one necessary industry or one necessary company or one necessary person. Instead, you're looking at what the summary of all of those things is in that specific national or global context. So this is looking at things like what happens if the unemployment rate across the whole economy goes up, right? Or goes down. right? This might be something related to like, will cutting interest rates stimulate economic growth across all industries that exist in society? So these are sort of two divisions here, right? We're looking either at a very specific contained situation in microeconomics, or we're looking at the summary of all of these different economic transactions in the form of a national picture or a global picture in macroeconomics, right? So that's sort of the division that exists there. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about supply and demand. I know supply and demand and like the lines on a graph are used in like memes all the time, but like let's unpack what these words mean, right? So supply is the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity that is produced of that good, right? And notably, supply is very interesting because a lot of people don't think about it in a specific context. But if pizzas sell for $5, right, people might be willing to produce 100 pizzas. If all of a sudden pizzas sell on the open market for $10, you're probably incentivized to make even more pizza because you see all this potential earning potential that exists out there for higher amounts of money, right? So notably, the relationship between the quantity produced and the amount of supply of a good that exists is very directly related with the price that you can sell that good for in the market. The more expensive something is, the more of an incentive there is for people to produce more of it, because they want to be able to get that earning potential. If something is less expensive, then there's less of an incentive to make more of it, because I don't know, if something is not that expensive and when you sell it, you don't get that much money, you're not as incentivized to make as much of it, at least according to economics, right? Demand has what's known as like an inverse relationship, right? So basically, it's the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity that people want to purchase, right? And notably, the higher of the price of something is, the lower there is demand for people wanting to purchase it. If a chocolate bar is $2 per bar, right, people might be willing to buy a certain amount of it. If the chocolate bar was all of a sudden 10 cents per chocolate bar, I would probably buy the entire store, right? And that's the meaningful difference that exists there, that the lower the price is for a particular thing, the higher the demand is. So while supply ends up being like just like a regular standard correlation line, demand ends up being the inverse. I would draw it for you guys, but I'm terrible at using the Zoom tool to draw things. So, okay, let's talk about shifts in supply and demand and things that might influence them in a lot of these contexts, right? So let's look at demand increases, right? So this is where the price and quantity sold ends up increasing, right, due to a demand side increase, right? So notably, one example of this might be that if there's a very good advertisement for a beauty product, then more people might be influenced to purchase that specific thing. And as a result, the demand for that product goes up, right? There might be demand decreases, right? This might exist in a situation where, what if we find out that a brand of vitamins contains harmful chemicals? I would bet that a lot of people wouldn't want to buy it to the same extent as before, right? So the demand would dramatically go down. There are also things that can impact supply that are not directly related to price, right? So a supply increase might happen in a specific market. Let's say if a bunch of foreign dairy businesses decide to move into Canada, because now we have all the dairy that's produced in Canada, plus a bunch of foreign dairy that's produced out of Canada, meaning the supply ends up increasing in that specific context. There might be random instances of supply decreases as well, right? So like notably, one example of this is like there's a drought that kills a bunch of fruit trees, right? Notably, the very relevant one that ends up existing for supply decreases that like a lot of people see in their day-to-day life is like avocados. Like avocados are a terrible plant in terms of like whether or not they're able to like actually grow sustainably and like effectively, meaning like there's a lot of instances where like entire batches of avocado crops fail and like the supply of avocados like goes down a lot really significantly in a very quick amount of time, right? This has nothing to do with the price of avocados, merely there's a crop failure, which means that we don't have as much of a supply of avocados, meaning there isn't enough guac for a lot of burritos, which makes people sad, like myself, who loves going to Chipotle. Anyway, let's talk about another concept called opportunity cost, okay? Opportunity cost is another concept in economics, which talks about your best foregone alternative, right? So this is, if you want to think about this in simplest terms, this is the second best option that you would have had if you didn't pick the option that you did pick, right? So notably, if you have a free hour after school and your favorite activities that you want to do after school, they all take an hour long, are either watching Netflix, baking, or sleeping in that order. If you choose to watch Netflix, your second best option would have been baking, right? Therefore, the opportunity cost of watching Netflix is baking. The opportunity cost in this case would not be baking and sleeping, because sleeping would be your second best, your third best option in this specific context, right? So The opportunity cost only refers to the best alternative option that you would have had otherwise. Not all of the other alternative options that you had, but just the best one that you didn't end up choosing, right? So that's what your opportunity cost would look like. Another way to sort of phrase this, I guess, in a more sort of relevant context is like, if you decide that instead of studying for your math test, you are going to come to debate, right? You're going to come to debate practice instead. You could have done a lot of other things with that time that aren't studying for your math test. You could have, like, I don't know, like gone on a walk, right? You could have like gone to the ice cream shop, whatever, right? But the opportunity cost of you coming to debate is not all of those things. It's simply your second best option, which probably would have been to study for the math test, right? So that's another way to sort of look at opportunity cost. It's literally the second best option that you had in a vacuum, and it's the best option that you didn't pick in exchange for the thing that you did end up picking. All right, let's talk a little bit about this thing called efficiency. The word efficiency gets thrown around a lot in economics debates, but a lot of people don't really, like, a lot of people just use the word efficiency without considering what it is, right? So efficiency is like when you get to a point where you can't make someone better off without making someone worse off, right? In a specific context, right? So we think of economics in the context of like distributing a bunch of things from a basket, right? So like, let's say we have a group of 4 people and we have a basket, right? And we have 12 apples in the basket. If I start distributing 1 apple to each person, we get to a point where eventually every single person has 3 apples. At that point, I have no additional apples to give people. The only way for me to give an apple to someone else would be to take an apple from another person and give it to a person, like another person in that specific context, right? So that's why we're referring to sort of efficiency in that context, right? So notably, like one example of this is like economists incorporated an auction system for food distribution in the US, which increased the number of useful products each food bank received, while also reducing food waste, right? In this specific context, right? So like, this is an example where like you're not really, you know, going past the bounds of efficiency, because you're taking like a lot of food that's given, that would have otherwise gone to waste, right? So you're not like necessarily taking, you know, food that like is from someone else and redistributing it, but instead you're still distributing sort of out of that basket in that specific example. Pareto efficiency is a situation in which it is impossible to make someone better off without making another person worse. I guess one example of this, right, is that if John wins $1 million in the lottery, taxing his winnings would make him worse off, but it would give the government, you know, funding to help people in need, right? So notably, it's important to mention that like in a lot of these situations, just because you have to take money from someone else and then give it to another person does not necessarily mean that these are necessarily bad economic outcomes, right? We're just referring to this idea of efficiency and what it looks like. In this specific context, like we are in a situation of Pareto efficiency where like the only way the government can potentially fund some of these programs is to take money in the form of tax revenue and take it away from other people. But remember, that's not always intuitively and inherently a bad thing, right? Sometimes it's okay to go past these boundaries in order to actually take that money and use it to do better things, right? So just because you're in a situation in which it's impossible to sort of like make someone else better off by like, you know, just like giving this infinite money that like exists, like that doesn't mean it's bad to have redistributive policies, right? Like it just means like this is a good way for you to look at the framing and the context for it. Okay, what are some of our motivations for decisions, right? So notably, we make decisions based primarily on, at least according to economics, based off of either self-interest or social interest, right? So self-interested choice, pretty easy to explain. It's the choice that is best for you, right? So you always order pizza. You order pizza because you are hungry, right? And that's why you want the pizza. The person that delivers the pizza delivers it because they want the money. So you are both making a choice out of self-interest, but then as a result of you both making choices out of self-interest, you both benefit from it, right? That's the sort of general idea. Social interest is when you make decisions based off of what is the best for society as a whole, right? So notably, government funds education because society is much better off when people are able to get access to education. Some of the biggest problems end up existing in terms of economic decisions when self and social interests don't line up, right? I mean, we can see this all the time in terms of like taxing billionaires, right? Obviously, it is not in the self-interest of billionaires to get taxed. But notably, social interest would dictate that maybe we should significantly tax them more, right? So the conflict between self-interest and social interest is one of the big things that ends up being discussed in terms of economics there. All right, let's talk about the second part of this seminar, right? We're going to talk a little bit about economics arguments and trade-offs. So notably, right? So there are a lot of different important things to mention in terms of the ways in which economics comes into our debates, right? The first thing to talk about is like the effects of class-based inequality and how they manifest into a lot of economic debates that we have, right? So notably, class-based inequality in many instances might look like a number of structural economic disadvantages that you are put into in a specific social situation. One, right, unemployment is something that becomes much more difficult to escape, and it also significantly restricts your ability to make purchases for your daily life. Two, you have a lack of access to a lot of social services. This is especially true in the United States, where like a lot of social services are still privatized, and as a result, you have to like pay significant sums for them, right? But I mean, this is also true in Canada, right? Like just because we have like government-run healthcare doesn't mean it's always accessible, doesn't mean it's always built considering a lot of the effects of class-based inequality in this mechanism, right? So social services are a big thing that you sort of are disadvantaged in terms of receiving, but there are also other social services that you might not be able to like as easily participate in, or like being able to put your kids in participating in like, I don't know, community sports organizations and things like that, right? So notably, that's another important thing to mention. Three, right? It's self-perpetuating in the long run, right? So in a lot of instances, social policies that are being made as a result of economics tend to significantly like in the longer and longer run benefit people that have more capital, whereas remove protections for people that have less capital in society. Four, right? There's a lack of social mobility that you end up class-based inequality, because while like in wealthier families, people are able to consistently pass down more and more assets and as a result accumulate wealth, the lack of ability to meaningfully have enough disposable income to accumulate that wealth means that that ability does not really exist in the long term as well. And there's also democratic distortion, right? So notably, looking at the way in which our democracy and our public policy is largely made by people and lobbied by people that are like sort of in higher upper socioeconomic classes, and not really as sort of reliant or not really as sort of accountable to people in lower socioeconomic classes in society, right? So super important to mention there. There are also aspects of geographic inequality that come into economics that are super important to mention, right? So notably, right, like there are specific instances in which there's geographic immobility, right? People are not just able to always simply move to a more prosperous area because of a number of reasons. One, there are already community links that are established in a lot of cases, meaning people don't really have the same ability to move in a lot of contexts. Moving, right, requires significant amounts of financial resources. Skills that certain workers have in rural areas may not be as in demand in a lot of city-based economies and a lot of urban economies. And cities that often have higher amounts of opportunities also have higher amounts of living costs, right? This would make sense if you look at the situation in like, I don't know, like rural New York, where there exists a lot of like unemployment, but notably the living cost of living in New York City, where a lot of the jobs exist, is so high that it actually acts as a barrier and prevents people from coming in and being able to access a lot of these opportunities that might potentially exist. There are also a lot of things known as poverty traps, right? So a poverty trap is the idea that people in poverty are stuck in poverty because there are barriers that prevent them from escaping poverty, right? Structural economic barriers that have been set up by the specific social structure that we currently live in, and like they cannot be overcome without a certain amount of capital that you have accumulated, right? So one example of this might be like there's going to be an inability to acquire significant amounts of resources, right? And I mean, this holds true specifically as well in the global south. You see this a lot, where like one of the biggest ways to get out of poverty historically has been through education. But if the government doesn't put significant investment into public education, and as a result, there's an entire system based around private education, which is significantly high in terms of the amount of money that you have to put in to receive it, your capacity to acquire resources like education to advance yourself are severely limited, right? Two, there's significantly lower access to things like credit, right? So notably, a lot of the ways in which banks set up, the ways in which you can get a mortgage, right, to actually get a house, the ways in which you can get approved for like a potential like rental or a leasing agreement now in the status quo, right? Your ability to even get a credit card, right? These are things that are very difficult to do if you don't engage as much in the formal economy, and you're kept out of the formal economy by your specific situations, right? As a result, you're not able to set up a very significant borrowing history, which in the long term means that you're structurally kept out of things like housing, you're structurally kept out of things like renting, you're structurally kept out of things like even being able to use a credit card in a lot of these contexts, right? So that's something that's very significantly significantly disadvantageous in that specific context as well, right? And the third and most evident one is like poor infrastructure, right? This might be something as like a lack of access to like basic needs such as water, food, electricity, which effectively prevent you from being able to mobilize your resources and sort of getting out of the impoverished situation that you find yourself in, right? So I guess another thing that we can talk about in the context of like economic issues is creative destruction. Creative destruction refers to as like a product of capitalism where old businesses and technologies fade away in favor of like new technologies and businesses. What this ends up meaning is that like we develop new technology, which does cause like, I don't know, our overall economy to grow and there's more productive work in the long run. But notably, if you're specialized in different industries, if you're specialized in certain types of work, right? All of that abilities and all that skills development that you have put into that job necessarily goes away as you lose the old jobs and there's a collapse of the older companies that end up existing in that specific context as well, right? So that's something that ends up happening as a result of economic shifts in the structure of our society. Okay, so what is a trade-off then, right? A trade-off, right, is a constraint that says that you have to give up one thing in order to get something else, right? It's tied to the opportunity cost idea that we were talking about earlier. The reason why a trade-off is so important in a debate is because a lot of the times you're going to be debating something and it's going to say that we should either do this or we should either do that, right? One big example of this is there's a very popular debate motion, which is about whether or not we should build low-income housing, right, or affordable housing projects in like rich, affluent areas, right? And the trade-off is like instead you would want to build them in like not as affluent areas, as the sort of counter proposition that exists in that specific context. There's always someone in a particular debate round that's like, why don't we do both, right? Why don't we do it there and then we do that as well? The issue with that goes back to the issue of scarcity, right? Like we don't really have, or like governments don't really have infinite amounts of money that they can just invest into like every single good social program that they want to implement, right? Like it would be awesome if they did, but like they don't, right? So in that specific context, and in many situations of debate, you're going to be forced to either support one specific economic, solution or another economic solution without being able to effectively like lobby to have both of them implemented at the same time, right? So you need to do one at the expense of another, right? So this is super important and super relevant in the context of a debate, right? So that's something sort of important to mention there. All right, let's talk a little bit about this thing called foreign exchange. I don't really know how much this is going to apply into a lot of rounds that are coming up, but this might show up a lot in a lot of debates if we're considering very important sort of developments in terms of currency manipulation and those accusations that have been leveled in specific contexts. There's going to be some discussion about whether or not the US dollar should still be like the number one foreign currency that exists globally. So, I mean, this might come up a little bit, so we should probably talk about it. But money is just like a regular good, right? And a currency is like a good that can be purchased or sold, right? So if we look at the Canadian dollar, which at the time of this presentation, one Canadian dollar was worth 75 American cents. This is not the case anymore, but that's okay. But what this means then effectively is that if you have one Canadian dollar, right, with that Canadian dollar, you can buy 75 cents of American dollars, right? Just as if the American dollar was like a good, right? Like it's like if you had a Canadian dollar and you could use that to buy a pack of gum, right? Like in the same way you can trade your Canadian dollar for a pack of gum, you can trade your Canadian dollar for 75 American cents, right? That means if you had an American dollar, you could trade it for $1.33 Canadian dollars, okay? The difference between like foreign exchange and like a normal goods market is like what the purchase actually ends up meaning and the significance of it, right? So a Canadian with $1 can buy 75 cents worth of American goods, but an American with $1 can buy $1.33 Canadian worth of Canadian goods, right? So you get some structural advantages if you have a currency that tends to be more valued than another, right? That's something super important to mention. I mean, I don't know how often you guys sort of go outside of Canada or outside of North America, but like if you go to India, the current exchange rate, I'm pretty sure, is like one Canadian dollar buys like 50 Indian rupees, right? So there's a lot of significant purchasing power that you end up getting if you convert Canadian dollars into Indian rupees, right? But that's just one sort of example in that specific context, right? So there are a few things that affect the value of currency, and we're going to sort of go through what some of these key valuation metrics are here, right? So one is trade, right? Buying and selling of goods between countries influences the value of that currency, right? So when you buy something from another country, you're paying for it in your own currency, right? So then the country that you ended up buying the goods from will take the currency that you gave them, they'll sell it, right, to buy their own currency, right? This increases the supply of your currency, right? There's more of your currency now out there, meaning the value of your currency ends up going down, right? The price of it ends up going down because there's more of it. It's less sort of rare in that specific context, right? So let's look at this in terms of a very specific example, right? If you're an American and you're buying apples from Nova Scotia, right? You're going to purchase these apples with your American money, right? And the Canadian company is gonna sell it to buy Canadian dollars. So you buy an apple that costs you $1 in American dollars. The Canadian company is going to sell the American dollar that you just gave them to buy $1.33 of Canadian dollars, right? So remember, going back to our initial discussion of supply and demand, that when supply increases, right, price decreases, and when demand increases, price increases, right? So notably, because the Canadian company is selling the $1 American, right, the supply of American dollars on the open market now goes up. Therefore, the price of American dollars will go down, right? Notably, when it sells the American dollar, the Canadian company, when its value in Canadian might actually decrease from $1.33 to $1.32 because of specifically that downward shift in the price. This means that like the US dollar can now purchase less in Canadian, and the Canadian dollar could now purchase more in American dollars than previously possible. Looking at the flip side of this transaction, right? If they're giving away that American dollar and they're demanding Canadian dollars from the market, that means the demand for Canadian currency has also gone up slightly, right? And as a result, instead of now the exchange rate being $1 American dollar to $1.33, it might go down to $1.32 because now there's more American dollars out there and you had a demand for Canadian dollars, which puts an upward pressure on Canadian dollars and a downward pressure on American dollars, slightly changing what the exchange rate is. Obviously, this is a very small, insignificant example, but this is looking at like these types of transactions that happen on a daily basis across the economy, which causes the currencies to either go up or down, depending on a lot of these mechanisms there. So overall, right, just a summary of this, when a company exports goods, the value of their currency increases while the value of the purchaser's currency relatively decreases, right? Exports cause the currency of a country to increase in value, and imports cause the currency of a country to decrease in value. This tends to be why you see a lot of countries historically and around the world that are dependent, right, on a lot of foreign goods and that have to consistently import more and more of these goods into their country to flood the global market with their own currency, making their own currency's value go down significantly, right? So that's something you intend to see as well. Okay, second thing, interest rates, right? So banks will tend to purchase currency from countries with higher interest rates. So one example is if the American interest rate is higher than the Canadian interest rate, bankers in Canada will purchase more American dollars because they'll make more money lending in America than they would in Canada, right? You can also flip this on its head. So if you have a particular reason if you have a particular reason that the American real estate interest is higher, right, in this specific context, right? Like you can use that as a very specific strategic thing in this specific context. Ty, do you want to elaborate on this?
No, I think I'm okay.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Okay. Just making sure. Okay. Anyway. Yeah. So in a lot of instances, like the opposite of this case is also true. So American banks often do this as well. So if American banks notice that Canadian interest rates are higher, they might notice that, okay, well, if we're going to give like a lot of the specific things in Canada, right, like we might make a significant higher amount of money. Like the opposite in this case would also be true in that specific case. Okay. Foreign investors will tend to invest in countries with higher interest rates, right? And the reason why is because a lot of people have to look at what they're specifically looking for in this context, right? So notably, if you're an investor and you're looking for a place to put your money and you're letting that money accumulate in value, what ends up happening in that specific context, right, is that foreign investors will tend to value countries in which their money can accumulate the highest amounts of interest, right? This is why, right, like the currency of countries with high interest rates will tend to increase in value because more and more of like this money is coming into their country in that specific context, right? More and more foreign investors are giving up their currency, putting it out in the open market, and they're demanding your currency to be able to take advantage of that higher interest rate that exists, which causes this value of currency to shift in that regard. Okay, let's talk about this, right? So there are certain benefits that might exist for having a lower versus higher valued currency, right? Because notably, if you're able as a country to control what value your currency is by taking a lot of strategic actions, why wouldn't every country just try to keep increasing the value of its currency, okay? If you have a lower valued currency, this is beneficial for countries that pursue things like manufacturing because it means that it attracts purchasers from other countries to come into their country and buy things, right? So notably, right, like if you don't have a significant amount of companies in your own country to establish competitors to like, manufacturing, abroad and things like that, right, or to create competitors in that specific context, you allowing a lot of these foreign companies to come in and like do their manufacturing in your country is a strategic advantage for you, because they're able to, on their perspective, right, they're able to basically get more goods for their value because they're using a more powerful currency. But on your perspective, because you have a lower currency, that country is more likely to choose your country for that manufacturing to begin with, as opposed to going to somewhere else, right? Or as opposed to manufacturing domestically. The example for this then would be if Apple decides to manufacture their products, I don't know, in China instead of manufacturing them in America, right? In America, they could use their money to manufacture iPhones, but they would get less iPhones for the amount of money they would invest. If they were to invest in a country like China, which is a slightly lower valued currency than the United States in the specific context, then they might be able to get more iPhones for their specific value that they end up investing in this specific context, right? The benefit for America or the American company in this context is like they get to have cheaper manufacturing. And the benefit for the country with the lower currency is that instead of that business going to stay domestically and that manufacturing staying domestic within America, they now get the contract to be able to do that manufacturing instead, right? So in some cases, there is still structural advantages to having lower currency values in that context. However, there are also a lot of benefits, obviously, of having a higher valued currency, right? So notably, having a higher valued currency is beneficial for countries that already have a significant amount of capital and whose goods are in demand, right? So if you don't need to necessarily do manufacturing exports, and you know that a lot of countries around the world already want to purchase a lot of your products, then you don't really need to have a lower valued currency, right? A lot of those countries are going to purchase your products. And if you know that those countries are going to purchase your products, you would want them to purchase them in your higher valued currency. And as a result, they have to give up even more of their specific currency to you in order to get those products from you, right? So you get the best value for your products if you have a higher valued currency in this specific context. So whether you have a higher or a lower currency is largely contingent on whether or not what your specific economic structure is at the time and what your specific economic priorities are at a given time. Okay, let's look at some case studies and some examples of what this looks like, right? So one example of this is the case study of the European Union, right? So I don't know how much you guys know about the European Union, but this probably will come up in a debate at some point. But a lot of the European Union has this thing called a euro. Right? The euro is
Vidit, try not to block your mic too much, just because I can't hear you right now.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So the European common currency is called the euro. It's not used in every single European Union country, but it is used in most of them, right? So it's important to talk about, right? So notably, if you use a common currency across a lot of different countries, right, what that ends up meaning is that they're locked into the same economic market, right? They're all connected to each other on the basis of this one specific currency. So if you had a lower valued European currency, a lower valued euro, this would be really good for countries that wanted to pursue manufacturing and don't have a lot of capital to establish their own domestic companies. A higher euro, though, would be really valuable for countries that have capital in demand and don't need to rely on manufacturing exports to fuel their economy. So notably, Germany has a very strong automobile economy, right? They want to be able to sell their cars worldwide. They would benefit from a higher exchange rate because people would end up paying more for their cars. This wouldn't be as beneficial for another country that didn't really have this established market in this specific context and was still reliant on manufacturing as their main mechanism of economic growth. Right? Secondly, though, right, one problem that you arise with this common currency is that the individual countries in the European Union don't set their own interest rates, right? So notably, right, the interest rates in the European Union are sort of converged around a very specific interest rate that ends up existing, right? So one, what this means then is that if there's a central authority establishing what this interest rate is, the different countries cannot adjust what their value of their currency is based off of specific situations that might arise, right? If in one country there's a very specific crisis that requires them to lower the value of the currency, they cannot do that because it's still decided by a central authority in that specific context, right? So not all countries have the same goals for development and the long-term economic future, meaning if they don't set their own interest rates, they can't respond to uniquely specific situations for their own for their own economic situations in that specific context. This is why you see a lot of doubts over whether or not this common market can function. You take countries with very different economies like Greece and Germany, and you expect them to function under the same economic conditions and the same long-term economic development plan, which fundamentally is not the case, right? So that's super important to mention there. Okay. We're going to talk a little bit lastly about resource distribution, and I think that'll probably take us to the end of the seminar. But okay, a lot of the questions in economics are very significantly tied to resource distribution and how we divide up our resources, right? So for example, if we have 100 muffins, how do we distribute them amongst 100 people, right? There's often a trade-off between efficiency and equity, right? So if Helen is a multimillionaire, it would be efficient to let her keep all her money because it costs money to redistribute it, right, through taxes or whatever. However, redistributing the money could cost and improve a lot of people's lives, right? It could improve the quality of their life significantly. So yeah, even if it would take a lot of like hassle to tax the money and redistribute it, it might still be something that we should do, because even if it's not the most efficient thing, it is still something that would be significantly valuable in the context of society. There are a few examples that we can cite of like self versus social interest and how that impacts a lot of big issues that are likely to show up in economics debates. So one is like globalization, right? So if we look at expanding international trade, some benefits that might exist to people is like you get more goods at like a lower cost, right? Like I don't know, like Amazon is like a terrible corporation if we consider the aspect of like I don't know, like Amazon in terms of like the treatment of workers and like those types of things that have been discussed. But like genuinely, like a lot of people benefit from like lower prices because of Amazon, right? So there's some like self-beneficial interests and incentives that exist there, right? There might be some cons of this though, right? Like while some Canadians benefit from lower prices of goods through Amazon, a lot of Canadian jobs might be lost, right? And then, I mean, this is true of any sort of manufacturing instance in this case, right? So if Nike moves to Malaysia to make shoes, we get cheaper shoes in Canada, right, for Canadians that want to buy them. But Canadians that worked in the industry of producing them lose their jobs, right? So social interest here clashes directly with individual interest, right? Secondly, climate change, right? Do we continue to extract resources at the cost of our environment, right? Notably, in a lot of places, the answer might be yes, right? If we gain materials that are necessary for the economy, like metals and oil, it might still be good in the immediate context to continue to extract these minerals. Obviously, right, the answer might be no if you consider the general societal impact, right? Like you lose out if you lose out a lot of economic opportunity, and you also like have a situation in which like basically you're having the worst impacts of climate change arise in a lot of different contexts, which is eventually going to cause a lot of like widespread social catastrophic destruction. One of the big economic discussions that ends up happening in this specific context related to climate change is like the ways in which Western countries interact with countries in the global South about a lot of these economic issues, right? So it's all well and good for us in Canada to say, hey, we should protect the global social interest of making sure that like oil is not harvested as much and we do less mineral extraction and all of these things. But notably, Canada benefited significantly from the extraction of those goods historically, right, from the 1800s onwards, whereas a lot of like developing countries that were colonized by a lot of imperial powers never really got to access those mechanisms and levers of economic development that structurally put a lot of Western countries ahead. Now, when we tell countries, as Western countries, we tell other countries that, hey, you shouldn't do things like extract oil and natural gas, despite the fact that many people in those countries might rely on those things as like the immediate method through which they get fuel and electricity in their daily lives, right? It does seem very paternalistic, right? So there is questions that we have to answer in the context of economic self versus social interest questions with climate change that not only deal with climate change and how we deal with it in terms of like, preventing extraction of a lot of these fossil fuel resources, but also this idea of climate justice, right? How do we take on the burden for a lot of these issues in terms of the economics of it for a lot of developing countries that historically did not get the huge head start from a lot of these extraction processes that existed in imperialist nations historically, right? So that's super important to mention there as well. Lastly, right, economic instability, right? How much risk can we take in order to get economic growth, right? And this is something that's super important to mention, right? So like one, when you loan money to people, you're taking a risk because people might, not pay you back. However, loans create growth because the person that, is like making the loan gets interest, and the person receiving it is likely to use it either to invest in their company or either to basically fund their house or a variety of different things, right? So it does expand the amount of economic growth that ends up existing, right? So the question is like, yeah, maybe our self-interest might always be to not lend, right? And it might be in the self-interest of like banks to not lend. But the potential that you have from that loan might be beneficial in the long term for social interest, because one, it means more people can do things like start entrepreneurship and like buy houses and do things like that, which is in the long term good in the economic situation. And you still benefit from it because you get interest rates on your return on that specific investment, right? So there are many instances in which self-interest and social interest definitely clash in the context of economics. that was a lot of me just like spitting out a lot of like different economic concepts at you, because I want you guys to sort of understand some of the general frameworks that exist. However, if you have any further specific questions, like please let me know at any point. But obviously keep these things in mind. We're going to post this online, if anything, if you want to review any of this at a later time. But I think we can stop recording, Tyler, and probably take questions, and then